In a house on the outskirts of Chicago, where the winds of winter mornings walked along the creaking shutters and the glass in the windows slightly fogged up, the Miller family always seemed the embodiment of the ideal. A large, cozy house with a garden well kept and filled with life was located in one of those areas where neighbors knew each other by name and met on weekends for a cup of coffee or a barbecue in the garden. John Miller was known in the city as a successful businessman, the owner of a small but prosperous construction agency. In his life, he had everything: money, status, power, and, it would seem, the selfless love of his wife, Hannah. Hannah was a woman whose life was dedicated to keeping her home in perfect order. She looked after the children, she looked after the household, she maintained in John the ideal she felt he so deserved. But behind the facade of love and devotion there was something darker. With each passing year, her feelings for her husband gradually faded. John was away at work more and more often. He was home late more and more often. And when he did appear, he was no longer the same person he had once been. He seemed tired, distant, as if he were always somewhere far away, in another world where there was no room for her care and attention. She noticed that his looks had become colder, and his smile was such that it could not melt her heart. Hannah felt that her husband no longer needed her as much as before. He increasingly left her alone at evening meetings with colleagues, forgot about family holidays, about dinners together. He did not notice how slowly but surely her world was collapsing. And although Hannah did not say it out loud, she knew. Everything was not as it was before. She wondered from time to time what John was hiding, where he went at night. But this uncertainty did not lead her to any action. She was a woman whose upbringing had taught her to be silent. She was used to being there, even when her presence brought no satisfaction. But perhaps her patience came to an end the moment she saw him by chance one day. He came home late, as usual, and for a moment her gaze lingered on his face. His steps were light, like those of a man returning home after a long journey, and his smile was such that there was no trace of the man she had once loved. He passed her by without noticing. It was normal, but not for her. She stood in the hallway watching him pass, and suddenly her heart sank. He was the same, but no longer hers. And then she understood. There was no more family, no more what connected them. Later that evening, she found his phone on the kitchen table. It was a small, almost unnoticeable detail, but Hannah felt her heart pound in her chest. She had never picked up his phone, never investigated, but something in her subconscious was pushing her to do so. She picked it up, casting aside all doubt, and opened the messages. They were all there. Appointments, conversations, names, and there, among them, was the woman she couldn't forget. That moment had been a turning point. There were no loud emotions, no hysterics, but the inner calm she had long tried to maintain was now gone. Everything fell into place. Everything John had hidden was real. His secret was revealed. And against that background arose a feeling she could not shake off, a feeling of deception. Her husband, her life, their relationship, all of it was empty and ridiculous. Hannah did not feel like a victim. She did not feel angry. She felt empty. She knew he hadn't realized how much she had changed. But in her soul it was already clear that she wouldn't stay with him, wouldn't continue this deception. She knew John didn't care about her, didn't love her. And then, instead of trying to find a way out of this situation, she began to ask herself questions. What to do with all this? How to regain control? Several weeks passed, but her thoughts did not stop. She could not simply forgive him, but she could not leave him as he was, without consequences. Hannah was a woman who did not know how to endure. She had always preferred to be strong, and now the moment had come for her strength to manifest itself. She began to notice her husband going out more and more often for late-night meetings, his walks becoming more frequent. He didn't know she was watching him. Hannah was going to play her game. But she wasn't stupid. She wasn't going to make a scene or try to win him back with tears. She realized she had to play by her own rules. She began to look for something that could change the course of their lives. She began to look for a way to end this once and for all. It wasn't a vengeful desire. It was more like a need to make it so that she could finally be free of the emptiness that John had left in her soul, the emptiness that she had hidden for so long. At one point, her eyes fell on the life insurance policy John had taken out years earlier. Her hand almost automatically followed the lines, and she knew this was her chance. The policy was for $100,000, and she knew that money could be the force that would free her from everything that was holding her back. The insurance was her plan, her way out. She didn't see anything wrong with it. It was just a way to take back the life that had been stolen from her. Day after day, she built her plan slowly, until her whole world was in the hands of her own decisions. Hannah's plan didn't come together overnight. It wasn't a spur of the moment or a passing idea. It was a deliberate, cold strategy, crafted over years of patience and observation. Everything she did, every move, every look, every moment of silent refusal was part of something bigger she was working toward. She learned to hide her feelings, to pretend that her life hadn't changed. But no matter how hard she tried, no matter what mask she put on, at some point her emotions became so strong that they couldn't help but spill out. John continued his nightly excursions, but they were no longer random. He spent the night elsewhere more often, sometimes returning in the morning with some excuse. He was late at work or had gone to a business meeting. But Hannah knew that in reality, everything was different. She couldn't describe exactly what had changed in his behavior, but everything around him was different. She felt like their world was crumbling, and she felt an emptiness filling her from within. And now, when she was on the verge of a decision, she realized that returning to her old life was impossible. Day after day, Hannah found new ways to control the situation. Every move she made was aimed at one thing: regaining control over what she had lost. She didn't like taking extreme measures, but now that John was tearing her world apart on his own, she couldn't do otherwise. It was all for one thing: her future. And money was what stood between her and the final victory. She looked for ways to approach this matter so that nothing could reveal her plans. Insurance was her key. It made sense. She could calmly continue her life with the money that John's death would bring her. Money would solve everything. The emptiness would finally be filled. She remembered John bragging about his policy years ago when he had taken it out. It had been one of those evenings when they had sat on the porch, sipping wine and watching the last rays of daylight fade over the horizon. He had said that he wanted her and the children to be provided for if anything happened. He had been a good husband, caring, thinking of her safety. There had been no hint of deception in his eyes. He believed that he was looking out for his family, and Hannah believed in his good intentions. And no matter how much she tried to think of him as her rock, her protector, her man, she felt more and more alienated from him. Hannah began secretly looking for ways to get rid of John. She didn't know how exactly it would happen, but she knew she had to be prepared for any scenario. Everything had to be perfect. This was her chance, her opportunity to break free from this tyranny, and she wasn't going to waste it. First, she decided to look into how the policy worked. She knew he didn't care what happened to his insurance. He never asked who the beneficiary was except her. She checked the paperwork John had left at home several times. The policy was in her name, and she was listed as the primary beneficiary. But there was still the question: what if he changed his mind? What if he changed his plans, took out another policy in someone else's name without her knowledge? She couldn't take any chances. She had to make sure the policy was in her hands and that nothing could interfere with it. Her journey began with her playing the naive. She carefully pretended not to suspect anything, continuing to play the role of a caring wife. When John was at home, she watched his every move, analyzing his every word. He remained cold and distant, as if he had long since lost interest. But despite this, Hannah kept him under control. Sometimes she even began to act as if everything was fine, trying not to irritate him. She knew that she needed to relax him, to make him feel safe. When he felt confident, he became carefree, and this gave her an advantage. She realized with surprise that now she was the one who controlled their lives, and there was not a single day when she did not manage to find vulnerabilities in him. One night when John came home late, Hannah told him she had some ideas to improve the family budget. She showed concern by suggesting that he review their spending to improve their financial situation. This was true, but only partially. Her plan was much deeper than just financial gain. She began to convince him that they needed to work on providing for the future. She told him that he worked too much, that he needed to think about providing for the children and her if something happened to him. And John agreed. He was too tired to doubt, too sure that life would go on as usual. Hannah supported his confidence. She made sure that he did not doubt her intentions. She made him trusting and careless. When he left his phone in the kitchen, Hannah decided to seize the moment. She knew his phone was a portal to the world he kept so carefully hidden. She scrolled through his messages. There were many different conversations, but one in particular stood out. Hannah couldn't be mistaken. She saw a message from her biggest threat, the woman John was likely in a relationship with. It was clear and obvious. She knew that not only did she now realize the truth, but she could use it to completely strip him of his power. Her plan was slowly but surely taking shape. There was only one step left, to poison him. At first, when this thought came to her mind, she tried to push it away, but over time she realized that this was the only way to end this game. She did not feel horror. She did not feel regret. It was not an act of revenge, but a logical step. John was the one who stood between her future and her life, and he was not worth pitying. She started looking for poisons. There were many suggestions on the internet, and Hannah carefully studied all the options. She was looking for something that would not leave a trace. She understood that she could not afford a mistake. There was no room for error in her hands. Hannah sat at the kitchen table, her eyes flickering over her computer, trying to find the exact poison she needed. She knew that to succeed in her goal, she had to act flawlessly, like a watchmaker assembling a complex mechanism. Every move, every step had to be carefully considered so that there would be no clue that could lead to her being exposed. Dozens of websites popped up on her laptop screen, offering various chemicals. She discarded many of them. They were either too well known or had side effects that would cause too obvious symptoms. Hannah was looking for something inconspicuous, something that would not leave traces, would not cause sharp reactions, would not attract attention. She searched for a long time and finally found what she was looking for, a poison that acted slowly, causing symptoms similar to food poisoning or a virus. It did not leave any traces in the blood and did not arouse suspicion at first glance. The purchase was easy. She used a fake account and paid in cryptocurrency to leave no trace. She felt relieved when she knew her order would be delivered to the nearest pickup point. This was an important step, but not the end. She knew it was just the beginning. Now all that was left was to prepare everything so that the poison would be in the right place at the right time. Every move she made at this moment was calculated. She knew that John would become more and more tired and worn out with each passing day. He had long since lost his spark, had long since been under her control. All she had to do was wait for the right moment to act. But to do that, she had to watch his habits carefully, wait for the moment when he was especially relaxed. John usually drank coffee in the morning. Hannah was sure that this would be the perfect time to add poison to his drink. All she had to do was carefully, without arousing suspicion, mix the poison into the sugar bowl. Hannah imagined how it would look. She would make her morning coffee as always, put sugar in the cup, and John would drink it without even suspecting anything. Everything would be calm, unnoticed. She nodded decisively to herself. Everything was going according to plan. All that was left was to check when John would be home again. She had to be sure that he wouldn't go out late that day, wouldn't stay for a late-night meeting with someone, as had happened before. Hannah sat at her desk looking at her calendar. Yesterday, as always, he had been late at the office. He often brought home reports that needed to be signed and spent several hours at the computer. At times like these, she could take care of all the preparations. She had to be ready. That evening when John came home, tired after a long day at work, she felt that he was especially weak. He didn't look like he usually did. She hardly noticed these little things, but now it became clear to her that he was not the strong, confident man he used to be. His steps were slow, his eyes were empty. Hannah knew that something was broken in his life. He was no longer the John who had supported their family for all these years, and now that he was so vulnerable, all she could do was wait for his next move. She no longer felt the same fear of his actions. Everything was under her control, and every move she made brought her closer to her goal. She checked the sugar bowl again, making sure that the poison was definitely in it. She could not afford a mistake. The poison was soluble in sugar, and its taste would not be noticeable. She imagined him drinking this coffee in the morning, not suspecting anything. Morning came. Everything was as she had planned. John, as always, woke up a little late, stretched and went into the kitchen. He looked tired. His face was pale, as if he had not slept well. He poured himself some coffee and sat at the table as usual. Hannah watched him from the kitchen, hiding her feelings. Everything was so calm and natural that she could hardly believe that everything was about to be completed. John sat down, picked up his cup, and drank some. Everything was going according to plan. Hannah, watching him, felt her heart beat faster. He took a few more sips and everything was calm. She sat down next to him, continuing to drink her coffee until John finally put the cup aside and said that he needed to rest for a while. She nodded, watching him go. He went into the bedroom and she stayed in the kitchen, thinking that now everything depended on time. She could not afford a mistake. Several hours passed and John did not return. It was strange. He was not weak enough to fall asleep right away. Hannah began to get nervous. She checked the time and suddenly realized that he was not coming out. She hurried to the bedroom and saw him lying on the bed. He was pale, his breathing shallow. Hannah's heart froze. Something inside her skipped a beat, but she did not show it. This was the moment when her plan was already working, and she could not allow herself to feel anything else. Time passed and John still showed no signs of life. Hannah stood up, walked to the bed, and felt his pulse. It was weak, but still there. A wave of relief rolled through her chest. Everything was going according to plan. After John had remained motionless for several hours, Hannah began to get nervous. She knew the poison was starting to work, but she also knew she had to be patient. Time was on her side. She walked slowly around the room, not allowing herself to show signs of excitement. No panic, no hasty action. She had to be in control until the very end. Besides, she knew that if John had died that same night, it would have looked too suspicious. The signs of poisoning had to appear slowly, and at that moment she hoped that his weakness was not just sleep, but the real effects of the poison. She returned to the kitchen, somewhat calmer. Hannah was not a woman who expressed emotion. Her life was usually precise and calculated. Before she had decided what she would do to John, her feelings had been under control. She had not acted out of anger or revenge. It had been much more cold and calculated. This was simply the next step in her life, a step that would free her from the shackles she had long felt. Time passed, and Hannah remained vigilant. She could call an ambulance, but that would mean she would lose control of the situation. She would be forced to explain what had happened, to give statements she could not tell the truth about. John had to be found dead. leaving no signs of a struggle, no traces of violence. Only then would her fears disappear, and she would be able to continue her life without looking back. By evening, John finally woke up. He looked even more exhausted than before, and his eyes were dull with pain. He looked at Hannah, trying to sit up, but his body wouldn't obey. Hannah saw it all. She felt his strength waning, his consciousness slowly fading into a fog. It was a game that was almost won. She had to act calmly and decisively. She came to him again, sat next to him on the bed. He was vulnerable, and this was her time. Hannah knew that now she could do anything and nothing could stop her. She held the power in her hands, the power over what was left of this life, the power that would make her life free. More hours passed, and John was fading further. His breathing became shallow, and his body lost all sense of life. He still tried to speak, but his words could not get through the painful coughing. He was unable to stand or even move. Hannah stood nearby, watching closely. She saw his eyes go blank, his consciousness lose its connections. It was not painful for her. It was more of a satisfaction because the end was near. Time passed, and when John finally closed his eyes, she knew that this was the moment. He was dead, and Hannah felt no regret. His death meant the end of her fear and the beginning of a new life. But Hannah knew that this was only one step on the path. Her tracks had to be covered, and she began to carefully clean everything around her. Nothing could be left. No tears, no traces, only emptiness. She looked around the room as if for herself and removed any small details that might attract attention, as if she were an evil spirit who left only cold in her wake. She knew that at least one person had to see John after his death, so that her tracks would be covered. That was her next step. She had already planned who it would be, someone she could trust, who might not even know what was happening. This was important. Hannah couldn't afford to make a mistake at this point. Everything had to be perfect. At that moment, an idea occurred to her. She remembered Catherine, an old acquaintance of John's. She was a frequent visitor to their home, and although their relationship was far from ideal, Hannah knew that her appearance at the right moment could help lend credibility to the whole thing. Hannah probably counted on Catherine not going into too much detail and accepting it as an incident that would be covered up in the public eye. She picked up the phone and dialed a number. Catherine was not one of John's closest friends, but she was someone he had a relationship with, albeit superficial. She had long since stopped hiding her dissatisfaction with Hannah, but she was not an active opponent. Catherine seemed unconcerned about the situation in the John family. Her interests were always superficial. She knew how to be hypocritical. Hannah did not doubt it. When Catherine arrived at the Miller's house, she didn't expect her visit to be so important. Hannah asked her to come in as if nothing had happened. The house was silent, and Catherine immediately noticed that something was wrong. She stood at the threshold, and Hannah silently pointed her to a chair in the corner of the living room. The atmosphere was heavy, without words, but Catherine was in no hurry to ask questions, believing that her visit was just an ordinary meeting. But her intuition told her that something unusual was happening in this house. Hannah quickly closed the door behind her and gestured to the couch. She walked to the window and pulled back the thick curtains, revealing a view of the city, which at that moment seemed especially empty, cut off from everything. She was silent for a long time, thinking about how to present everything to Catherine. She didn't want to give the direct reason for her visit, but everything that was happening required a quick and precise solution. She pulled herself together and said that John had gotten worse, that she simply could not cope with his condition, and he could not be left alone. Catherine did not immediately react to this message. She needed time to comprehend what was happening. Hannah knew in advance that her task was not easy. All she could offer was to help in organizing not only the resuscitation of the situation, but also its possible compensation. John wasn't dead yet, but he was getting worse. He was on the other side of weak, and Hannah felt that maybe something was wrong, that the whole plan was going sideways, that John was surviving despite everything. It was moments like these that she had to be especially careful. When Catherine looked up at Hannah, there was something uncertain in her eyes, something cold and uneasy. But Hannah did not want to lose her resolve. Catherine was her link to the outside world, and she needed to make sure that everything that happened to John was taken seriously, including his death. It had to be treated as an accident, an unfortunate event that was inevitable. John was sick for a long time. He couldn't take it, was what Hannah said to begin her explanation. Something inside her was pounding, but Hannah continued confidently. Catherine's breathing became even, and a certain look of worry appeared on her face. A few minutes later, Catherine sat down across from Hannah and looked at her carefully, as if she had understood something. Hannah's mind again slid over what needed to be done. She had to convince Catherine to be on her side. She had to do everything so that this woman would not be too inquisitive. Once on her side, Catherine could become her protector in these unusual circumstances, become a kind of tool for covering her tracks. He was weak, Hannah. You had to take charge of him. Make sure he wasn't left alone, Catherine said, as if noticing that it wasn't just John's physical condition, but something more. Hannah felt like she hadn't been found out yet. This situation with Catherine was still tense. The day dragged on. Hannah felt the pressure building inside her. Eventually, Catherine agreed to help, but she did so with a certain detachment that immediately made Hannah wary. She wasn't sure if she could trust her completely, but at this point, Catherine was still needed. She called an ambulance, did a few manipulations to attract the necessary attention to the situation. As the ambulance arrived and the doctor examined her, Hannah felt things starting to slip out of her hands. She couldn't afford to make a mistake, and the situation was getting worse. Catherine stood back, trying not to interfere, but her eyes were suspicious and her silence was unsettling. Doctors soon confirmed that John was in critical condition, but alive. Hannah felt her heart skip a beat. This wasn't planned. This wasn't part of her script, but she couldn't stop. Decisions had to be made fast. She expected Catherine to sense her insecurity now, and even more, she was afraid that her weaknesses would be revealed. But she kept her face and continued to manipulate the situation, trying to use the necessary mechanisms to keep everything under control. All she could do was wait. Hannah stood in the hallway, listening to the sounds coming from the kitchen where the ambulance crew continued to work on John. Doctors and nurses came in and out assessing his condition, unaware that his death was not an accident. Hannah felt like every move, every look, every question could be decisive. Inside, she was confused, but outwardly, she remained calm and collected. Catherine did not leave, did not show much interest, but did not become indifferent either. She kept her distance, as if everything that was happening was none of her business. She could play an important role in saving the situation, or, on the contrary, become the reason for its disclosure. Hannah decided that she had to act carefully, and not allowing herself to panic, she carefully controlled her words and actions. Everything was under control until Catherine approached her, slightly bowing her head. "Are you sure everything is okay?" Her voice was not as cold as usual, but rather wary. Hannah answered with a confidence that shocked even herself. "Yeah, it's okay. It's just another case where we can't do anything," she said in a way that Catherine could believe. But Hannah knew it was far from normal. Hannah tried to keep a cool head. She didn't have time to second-guess herself. She had to finish what she had started so her life could go on. But every moment of delay increased the risk. The risk that someone would discover the truth. The risk that her entire elaborate crime would begin to unravel. Time passed, and over the next few hours Hannah felt the tension growing. Catherine's silence was unbearable, and every look from her seemed to weigh heavily, like a sentence. She couldn't trust Catherine completely. Perhaps she suspected something. What if Catherine began to draw her own conclusions and decided to interfere? All Hannah could do was continue as usual, play the game as she had planned. One more thing, and John would be dead, and Hannah could turn around in a new life. But everything is not so simple. The risk remained, and even an unfortunate incident could reveal all her secrets. She increasingly paid attention to details, looked at the people standing nearby. And then she noticed something strange. When one of the nurses entered the room, she gave Hannah an odd look. Her eyes were a little wary, and there was a certain caution in her gait. Hannah shivered nervously. She could not afford a mistake. The doctors left, leaving John in the room, now showing almost no signs of life. His breathing became increasingly rare and labored, but Hannah still did not feel relief. Her mind was occupied with a parallel stream of thoughts: how to make sure that this moment would remain unnoticed, how to avoid mistakes that could come to light. She could not afford to forget a single detail. Catherine soon left the house. She thanked Hannah for her hospitality, but her tone was different, not like before. She didn't say anything unnecessary, but her look, her face, everything betrayed some kind of doubt. Hannah didn't know what exactly was bothering her. She couldn't understand exactly what had happened, but something in this silence became an alarm signal for her. After Catherine left, Hannah went straight back to John's room. He was conscious, but his condition was getting worse with each passing hour. Hannah went to him, watching his every move carefully. He was still alive, but she knew there was no other way. No matter how slowly time passed, his death was predetermined. She was sure of it. John would not survive the night. He was already dead inside. His body was just fighting back. She put down the glass of water she had brought him earlier. The poisoning was taking its toll. His eyes were cloudy, and his breathing had become even stranger and harsher. Hannah felt the pressure in her chest increase. It was the moment when she realized she could still control everything that was happening. But what if someone took her out of this game? With each step she took, she felt her chances diminish. Hannah tried to find the strength to not break down, to not let one wrong move ruin everything. But deep down, she felt something was changing. Too many elements were slipping away from her control. The night was falling. The time was approaching when her efforts would come to an end. But Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that she was just beginning to lose control. The night brought the inevitable. John was dead, and with him went the last hope Hannah had that everything would work out as planned. In the morning, as the light filtered through the half-open curtains, she stood at the window, feeling the weight of what had happened. He had died as he should have, but not as she had expected. His death was not instantaneous, nor natural. He died slowly, deliberately, with each breath he took, sinking deeper into that inevitable emptiness. Hannah felt more pressure than relief. Her mind reeled with fragments of thoughts, memories of every step she had taken to see this plan through to completion. But something in her confidence wavered, as if this murderous act had been more than just part of her calculation. This day seemed less important than everything that had come before it. She looked at John's body, his face motionless, his eyes glassy, his arms limp in lifeless poses. He was so familiar and so strange at the same time. But the worst part wasn't his dead body. It was that she knew she would have to face the consequences. It was just beginning. After Catherine left, Hannah sat in the empty room, thinking about how the world would soon learn of her husband's death. Everything had been arranged to make it look like an accident, so that no one would suspect her hand in it. But she couldn't help but think that now that John was dead, things would be much more complicated than she had imagined. When there was a knock on the door, she knew immediately that it was the police. Hannah opened the door, trying not to show her nervousness. She knew that she had to play her part as convincingly as possible. This was the first step in making sure that everything went according to plan, but she still felt a sense of unease. The police arrived quickly, as they usually do when an accident is suspected. They immediately began examining the scene, taking all the necessary samples, making notes. Hannah stood nearby, watching every move. She felt even more responsibility fall on her shoulders. Everything was in her hands. The responsibility for everything to go smoothly, without disrupting the prearranged plan. All she could do now was remain calm and control her emotions. But soon, after several hours of questioning and searching, the police finally left the house. Hannah was left alone. There were many thoughts in her head, but they all boiled down to one. She needed to get rid of all traces. The poisoning left too much evidence, and she could not afford a mistake. The traces that could lead to her had to be destroyed. Meanwhile, her attention was drawn to John's bedroom door. It was locked from the outside, but Hannah knew she had to double-check. At that moment, she noticed that one of the curtains on the window was slightly open. She walked over to the window and closed it, unsure why this was such a big deal. Maybe it was just the fear that someone would notice something that shouldn't be there, but it was impossible to pinpoint the exact cause of her anxiety. As the day turned to night, Hannah became increasingly exhausted. She began to realize that the part of her that was in control was now the victim. She was losing confidence, and the fear that her deception would be exposed grew with each passing moment. She couldn't stop. Her life was now built on a lie, and there was no turning back. Catherine came again. She came in the evening, unannounced. Hannah knew that she was not leaving, but probably suspected something that Hannah had not managed to hide. She could not let Catherine see her nerves, but her calm was on the verge of breaking. A cold wind hit her face when she opened the door, and Catherine, standing on the threshold, looked at her with curiosity. But there was neither surprise nor fear in her eyes. There was only tension. Catherine stepped inside, looking around as if checking to make sure everything was okay. Hannah quickly closed the door and motioned for her to sit, but Catherine did not accept the invitation. She continued to look around the room. Every movement she made seemed suspicious, as if she was searching for something. And Hannah, feeling the tension growing, began to doubt her intentions. "Are you looking for something?" Hannah asked, trying to hide her growing anxiety. Catherine didn't answer, but there was something in her gaze that made Hannah freeze. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something more, something that lurked beneath the surface of her words and actions. Hannah felt her body tense. All her control, all her efforts to keep the secret began to crumble. And then she realized that Catherine might know more than she was willing to admit. Several days had passed since John's death, and although everything seemed normal on the outside, the tension in Hannah's house was not letting go. Every event, every step towards hiding the truth was a new stone on her shoulders. She felt that all her efforts could be destroyed at any moment. It was necessary to watch every movement, every word. And then came the moment when she could hide nothing more. Catherine never left her side. Hannah began to realize that she was not just a family friend, but part of something bigger, and her behavior increasingly confirmed her suspicions. Catherine suspected. She looked for clues. She couldn't help but do so, and she found them. One evening, when Hannah was beginning to lose her patience, Catherine suddenly spoke. There were no words that would foretell the conversation, but Catherine, standing on the threshold, spoke confidently and with a quiet wariness in her voice. "Are you sure it was an accident? I can't stop thinking about it." Hannah froze, trying to hide her excitement, but there was something in her eyes that gave her away. It was clear. Catherine already knew what had happened. Hannah tried to protect herself, trying not to show her confusion. But she knew that the pressure Catherine was exerting was becoming unbearable. It was a game in which Hannah could no longer remain in the shadows. Catherine took a step forward, her voice firmer. "You already filed for insurance. I saw it. You were going to take the money, weren't you?" At that moment, everything became clear. Hannah tried to hide her feelings, but you could read fear in her eyes, fear that everything would be revealed. "You realize that everything you've done will have consequences?" Catherine continued. Her words weren't just an accusation. They were a verdict. Hannah wanted to refute everything, justify herself, find a logical explanation. But where would that lead? How to hide the truth when it was already so obvious? Medical experts confirmed the poisoning. And here it was, the moment when it was no longer possible to hide. Hannah knew that now her entire carefully constructed plan was falling apart. She tried to exhale, but the feeling of despair overwhelmed her with renewed strength. As it turned out, the insurance was the main goal. John was insured for a huge amount, $100,000, and Hannah had long planned how she would use this money to start a new life. However, her calculations were wrong. The insurance company was not going to just pay out the amount under the policy without additional checks. And then what Hannah feared most happened. The police suspected that her husband's death was not accidental. All signs pointed to poisoning, and traces of the poison left behind were found. New evidence came in. Investigators found inconsistencies in Hannah's statements. She had filed for insurance immediately after John's death, making no secret of her desire for payment. There were too many coincidences, too many inconsistencies for this to be a coincidence. Soon after another visit from the police, Hannah was under arrest. Prosecutors proved that she had used poison to kill John for money. Traces of poison were found in his blood. An insurance claim filed immediately after his death became key evidence. Catherine, it turned out, had long been on the side of justice. She did not make hasty moves, but when she became suspicious, she handed her findings over to the police. Her intuition was right. She was the kind of person who noticed what others might ignore. Hannah went to jail. Her life had fallen apart in a matter of days. The insurance she had craved had never arrived. All her vanity, all her calculations had been for naught. She was left with nothing but emptiness, the knowledge that she had lost everything she could have gained. Catherine, for her part, was satisfied that she had done the right thing, and now her soul was at peace. The tragedy was over, but the consequences of this act would remain for many years. Hannah realized that her desire for money and control had led her to disaster. Justice was eventually served, but it was too late for her. This story became a lesson for many. Sometimes what seems perfectly planned turns out to be just a merciless trap, and the desires on which dreams are built can destroy everything a person loves.